really controls the US dollar? You or a network you never voted for? In 1913, the Federal Reserve opened its doors. Newspapers celebrated, but presidents, bankers, and billionaires quietly rewrote the rules the public never saw. Today, we break the shadow network behind the US dollar and who really runs it now here. The truth might shock you. The US dollar looks like government money. But the system behind it starts somewhere most people never see. In 1913, while most of America focused on Christmas, a bill passed quietly. It creates the Federal Reserve System. The public hears federal and assumes government. The structure says something different. 12 regional banks overseen by a central board. Most of the shares in those regional banks sit in private institutions. That design matters more than the name. So here is the first puzzle. How does a country issue public money through a system built with private architecture? The push began long before 1913. In 1907, a banking panic hit New York hard. The stock market drops close to 50% bank runs spread. The government struggles to stop the fire, but one man acts faster than the state. J.P. Morgan. He locks top bankers in his library at 219 Madison Avenue. No one leaves until a rescue plan is done. By sunrise, he essentially engineers a bailout with private money and private decisions. The lesson sticks. America sees a fact in real time. When money shakes, private bankers move faster than governments. Therefore, reform talks explode. But reform means different things to different people. They spend 9 days designing a central banking blueprint. Their combined institutions control 1/4 of the world's wealth. The notes from that meeting, later confirmed by participants, form the spine of the Federal Reserve Act. 3 years later, Congress votes. President Woodrow Wilson signs it late at night. Later in life, he admits regret. He writes, "I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit." But here is the twist most books skip. The Fed prints dollars, yet the Treasury issues them. The Fed creates reserves, yet banks create loans. The banks create most of the money you use through lending with interest attached. That means the largest share of US dollars begins as debt. So ask the quiet question. If dollars start as debt, who earns first when money is born? And now consider this. In 1914, the US held 4% of the world's gold. By 1918, after World War I financing, it held close to 40%. War changed more than borders, changed balance sheets. The US government spends money first, then borrows that same money back. Not a guess, a design. The Treasury sells bonds to pay bills, but the system decides who buys them. Primary dealers sit at the center. These are the banks picked to trade directly with the Federal Reserve. J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Bank of America, and a small, closed circle of others. No rotating public list, no elections, no public vote. So when the government needs money, it sells treasury bonds. Then the primary dealers buy them, often with reserves created by the Fed itself. Therefore, the government gets dollars, pays interest on those dollars, and banks earn guaranteed returns on money that enter the system through the same loop. It sounds upside down the first time you hear it, but by the second time, the shape becomes clear. Then 2008 hit. Banks freeze. Credit stops. Companies can't borrow. Entire countries start running out of dollars. But the world runs on dollars, so a shortage anywhere becomes a crisis everywhere. Therefore, the Fed opens emergency swap lines. These let foreign central banks borrow dollars directly from the U.S. Federal Reserve. Between 2008 and 2011, over $10 trillion flowed through these lines to Europe, Japan, Switzerland, the UK, and beyond. That number rivals the GDP of entire continents, but people still think the Fed only serves America. That story ends in 2020. When COVID shocks markets, swap lines open again. At peak stress, nearly $450 billion per week moves through the Fed to global central banks. Not Congress, not treaties. A central bank decision moves more money in a month than most nations make in a year. However, dollars also exist outside the US system. The eurodollar market, dollars created through global bank lending, not printing, grows silently for decades. By 2024 estimates, it sits between $13 and $20 trillion. Most of these dollars never touch US soil. Most are created by private banks lending to each other in London, Singapore, and offshore markets. So when analysts say the Fed controls the dollar, that's only part of it. In normal times, private banks create more global dollar liquidity than the Fed itself. Then geopolitics enters the chat. In 1974, the US and Saudi Arabia locked oil sales into dollars. It becomes the quiet rule of global energy. Therefore, every nation needs dollars to keep the lights on and factories running. This turns currency into leverage. Sanctions now hit bank pipes faster than armies hit borders. And here is the shock waiting in the next chapter. If the Fed moved $10 trillion to save banks, why did it say no to $5 billion to save one country that nearly collapsed in 2001? In 2008, banks ran out of dollars, not a small shortage. A global blackout of the world's most needed currency. Companies can't pay suppliers, countries can't backstop their banks. The planet freezes, not because money disappears, but because dollars vanish from the pipes. The Federal Reserve sees the clock hit zero, so it opens something most people never hear about: FX swap lines. These let foreign central banks borrow US dollars directly from the Fed. Fast no IMF requests. No negotiations, no rescue speeches, just wire transfers. Then the numbers turn unreal. Between 2008 and 2011, the Fed pumped $10 trillion worth of dollar liquidity across the world. Let that sink in. $10,000 billion. Sent mostly to Europe, Switzerland, England, the European Central Bank, Japan, the biggest single borrower, the European Central Bank, pulling over $2.8 trillion at peak. Need Americans hear bailout, then assume Washington wrote the checks. But the real rescue wires come from the Fed in New York, moving at night while headlines talk about Congress. Then 2020 hits. COVID shuts borders, markets, and payrolls. The same dollar panic returns, faster this time. By March 2020, demand for dollars surges so violently that the Fed reopens swap lines again, wider and faster. At the peak, more than $450 billion per week moves through these lines. Japan pulls over $220 billion. The Bank of England takes $60 billion. Even countries never at war find themselves in a battle for access to U.S. currency. Therefore, the Fed becomes the world's emergency lender, not by treaty, not by election, by design. The global system places the dollar at the center, so when dollars choke, every financial organism on Earth gasps at once. However, most people still picture central banks as national servants. That story breaks when you see the plumbing. Then, the deeper truth clicks. The Fed does not rescue countries. It rescues dollar demand and dollar circulation. Nations come second. The system comes first. So here is the turning point nobody warns you about. If the Fed unleashed $10 trillion to save banks and global markets, why did only $1.2 billion reach emergency dollar lending for an entire region facing famine in 2017? Here's a fact most people miss. Most US dollars in the world never come from the US government printing press. They are created by banks, outside America, by typing numbers into balance sheets. This market started in 1957. London bankers invent a workaround to hold dollars without touching US soil. They call it the eurodollar market. No connection to the euro, just dollars offshore. Free from US banking rules, therefore it grows fast. By the 1970s, oil nations stashed their profits there. By the 1980s, global corporations borrowed money there. By the 1990s, banks built the biggest credit system on Earth with it. But here's the twist. These dollars are not printed. They are loaned into existence. When a bank in London lends dollars to a company in Tokyo, those dollars simply appear as credit, no mint, no trucks, no approval from Congress. However, the scale shocks most people. No one knows the exact size because no single regulator tracks it. The BIS estimates put the offshore dollar system around $13 to $20 trillion. Some analysts argue the true footprint, including derivatives tied to it, runs far higher. Then comes the interest rate underneath it all. For decades, global dollar pricing has run on LIBOR, a rate set by a handful of banks. In 2012, investigators proved the rate was manipulated. Barclays pays $450 million in fines. The system quietly shifts to safer in 2021, so now the world runs on dollars mostly created abroad, priced by private markets, and monitored after the fact. Here's the question nobody asked on TV. If over 90% of global dollar activity happens outside U.S. borders, when a crisis hits and $20 trillion shakes, who exactly catches the fall? Here is a clear fact. In 1974, the U.S. signed a deal with Saudi Arabia. America offered military support and equipment. In return, Saudi oil would be priced only in U.S. dollars. Every barrel, no exceptions. Then OPEC followed the same model. So if a country wants oil, it needs dollars first. That simple detail changed everything. Demand for the dollar became global, permanent, and tied to fuel, trade, and survival. Therefore, dollars turned into leverage, not just money, but leverage only works if access can be limited. And in 1973, the SWIFT payment network began. By 2025, more than 11,000 banks in 200-plus countries rely on it. If a nation is removed from SWIFT, it struggles to buy, sell, or move money across borders. However, sanctions add a stronger grip. In 2012, Iran got cut from SWIFT and lost nearly 50% of its oil revenue within months. In 2022, Russia faces sanctions that freeze roughly $300 billion in foreign reserves in days. No tanks, no troops, just wires, banks, and access turned off. Then the real alliance shows itself. Governments protect the system. Banks operate it. The dollar flows through both, but answers to neither completely. So in the end, the dollar functions like shared infrastructure. Countries depend on it. Banks route it. The U.S. guards it. No treaty ever voted on this. It simply formed step by step. And here's the next twist. If one private company ever controlled 2.5 billion people's payments at once, would the world treat it as a bank, a state, or something with more reach than both? In 2023, the Federal Reserve launched FedNow, a real-time U.S. payment network that moves money in seconds. This marks the biggest change to U.S. payment rails since the 1970s. The timeline matters because digital dollars stop being theory and become infrastructure. But FedNow lives beside another idea, much bigger, a central bank digital currency. A dollar written in code, not paper, not bank deposits. The Fed starts serious research in 2019, releases study papers in 2022, and confirms pilot testing with major banks after, so now two tracks exist at once. One is faster banking, the other is a new form of money entirely. Then scale comes into view. Visa can handle 65,000 transactions per second. FedNow starts smaller, then expands. But a full digital dollar system aims for national scale, instant settlement, and no off hours. Money would move like text messages. Therefore, the debate shifts from speed to rules. Who gets access? Who approves payments? Who blocks them? Who sees the data? These questions suddenly matter more than interest rates. However, privacy collides with architecture. A 2022 Fed report admits a digital dollar could allow varying levels of user anonymity depending on design choices. That means anonymity becomes optional, not default. Then politics enters the room. Some argue digital dollars widen access. Others warn the system could track every transaction ever made. So the real issue looks nothing like technology. It looks like permission. And here's the next question you need to sit with. If one app suddenly held 30% of all retail dollar payments in America and no one could opt out, would that be convenience or leverage in disguise? History leaves clues. Power leaves shadows. The dollar leaves questions. The next reveal changes everything. Click the next video on your screen right now before it disappears. Another story waits.